Today I will play as this Japanese shogunate, which at the beginning of the 19th century was still very backward, and its economy was based on the hard labor of serfs. However, I will transform this country into the most powerful economy in the world, almost twice as large as the British one. And all of this in the latest DLC for Victoria 3, The Great Wave, which was provided to me earlier by Paradox, so yes, this is a sponsored video in which you will see a very interesting and extensive path of reforming Japan, with truly difficult choices, a new mechanic of building presence in the world, how the system of building and designing ships works, as well as some conquest, to see how it works in practice. You, my dear viewer, can purchase this DLC using my link, which I received from Paradox. It is in the description as well as in the pinned comment. From each such purchase, I receive a really solid percentage, and it's a good way to support my channel. Personally, I hope that the material you will see today convinces you to do so. Without further ado, welcome Imperialists, Lucas here. I'll start by saying that quite a lot has changed in Japan and many things have been added, so if you play Japan in the latest expansion, you can expect the unexpected. Right from the beginning, I'm in a tougher situation, because Japan has been hit by heavy rains that have essentially devastated the entire island, and this disaster will last for a while. Kanto, previously one of the best provinces for early industrial development in Japan, still has very strong bonuses today. But the number of iron mines has been reduced from 36 to 1. Unless some future events increase that number, I'll let you know if they do. On the other hand, I now see a lot of gold mines in Japan that can be developed, and while I'd really like to build those gold mines, it would actually be a serious mistake. The Japanese market lacks many key raw materials as well as goods, and those need to be addressed first. So at the start, I'll build everything in Tohoku. I have both the population and all the necessary resources here. At the beginning, I built 5 to 8 construction sectors. Yes, Japan has solid budget income, but I also know that certain crises are coming that will reduce it, so I proceed cautiously. Next, 1 tool production building, 1 iron mine, and a lot of logging camps. That's enough for the start. Now I'll move on to research. First I picked the stock exchange, then research empiricism. I completely skipped the military tab. It seems that Japan currently can't wage early wars. I'll show you why in a moment. So I go straight to atmospheric engines and then railways. Now treaties. As you can see, Japan starts with 2. Fortunately, they're not as terrible as the ones in earlier versions of the game. But why pay China 700 gold every month when you can pay nothing? That's the pact I ultimately make for 10 years, unless it doesn't go through. But it did. I'll leave the pact with the Netherlands as it is. Japan also has a vassal and a tributary. I immediately start improving relations with both. Now, as Japan, I should designate my areas of interest, whether in Africa for gold or in South America for easy vassals. After all, I have a large army. But areas of interest are the first system that has been completely reworked, and you can check it in the diplomacy tab. It's no longer here. The entire world has been redesigned. Spheres of interest have been expanded, so you don't have to deal with many smaller ones. This is probably because they now have levels and need to be maintained. Currently, Japan only has a sphere of interest in this region. You can check it precisely in the diplomatic overview at the very bottom. As I mentioned, spheres of interest now have levels from 1 to 5. And look at this, level 5, when you are a local hegemon, gives incredibly strong bonuses. Reduced decree costs, reduced infamy costs, and increased trade advantage. And each level also increases the number of available diplomatic actions you can take with countries in that region, or against them. So this system has evolved from a simple click mechanic, click here, conquer there, into a more realistic system. Because now you really have to maintain your presence in a region. And you maintain it in the following ways: when your army and fleet are stationed in a given region, when you own a province there or have claims to it. But also through diplomatic pacts and trade agreements, you can increase your presence that way as well. So in theory, I can now declare war on any country in the world without marking areas of interest. In theory, because as Japan, I simply can't. This stems from the starting laws I have, so let's move on to politics and laws. You should already notice that quite a lot has changed here. We have a unique army model based on the warrior caste. We also have the Edo system, meaning the social hierarchy of Japan at the time. You can examine it in detail here. In the Society and Classes tab, the highest caste is the samurai, the middle one is the clergy and samurai, and the lowest is peasants and merchants. And I'm spending time on this because it will be important very soon. This system obviously affects the acceptance of a given social class and its satisfaction, but worse still, it affects professional qualifications, that is, how quickly I can turn a peasant into a factory worker. And here the reduction is incredibly painful as it amounts to 40 to 50%. The Bakufu power distribution is also very unique, as it provides very stable governance. However, it increases the political strength of the aristocracy, as well as the military. Bakufu roughly translates to government from a tent, referring to the idea that the highest ruler was the shogun as the supreme field commander, symbolizing the temporary nature of rule. In practice, the Tokugawa clan ruled Japan for 250 years. The most important law, trade policy isolationism, this law has been completely reworked, and it is precisely this law that forbids all aggressive diplomatic actions, including warfare. It also limits the number of trade centers to just one location. The first law I want to get rid of is serfdom. I will use the support I have thanks to my treaty with China. I will try to introduce tenant farmers. Although I won't hide it, peasant proprietorship would be much better, because it would also increase the political strength of the merchants, but it would seriously anger the daimyo and the samurai, and I don't want that. Now let's move on to the government. I immediately bring the peasants into it and confirm this decision, which will further make it easier to pass laws. In the general diplomatic overview, we already have a peasant movement right away, so I didn't have to trigger a revolt for it to appear, and for now, I also want to increase its strength. Additionally, we start with a new historical character, who is an agitator. He is the leader of this social movement with fairly traditional values. This social movement promoted an ideology that feels quite familiar today, namely Revere the Emperor. Expel the barbarians, immigrants. In short, this movement blamed Europeans for all of Japan's problems, considering them barbarians. But what's more interesting, at a later stage, when the Americans arrived to spread democracy, you know, big guns, ships and so on, it was this very movement that stood behind Japan's modernization. Because they realized that with an isolationist policy and without modern technology, they had no chance. And personally, I'm very curious whether this movement in the game will undergo similar changes. Returning to the law, I believe in one of the recent DLCs, they also introduced the option to negotiate with various social movements to support a given idea. In short, negotiations consist of promising something, doing something in return for gaining support, usually at the cost of increasing the political strength of a given faction. And in fact, right after unpausing, the first crisis erupts. Do you remember the rains I mentioned at the beginning? This is an event closely tied to the latest DLC, as indicated by this icon. And it stems directly from those rains and the famine that has engulfed the entire shogunate. Quite a start. And I have to admit, Japan has a lot of these events. I'll start by discussing the ones that have already begun. From the very beginning, we have the Tenpo era crisis, which we have 12 years to deal with. Here we can choose one of two paths. We can move toward reforms, which is the path I will take, or further strengthen the shogunate. And the second option seems to me to be the historical one. But what's even better, the final reward differs depending on how many reforms we manage to implement and which ones they are. Honestly, it's worth striving for the best ones, especially if you want to reform Japan. During this era, we also have two major national penalties: an increase in the number of radicals as well as loyalists, and an increase in the amount of food consumed by the peasantry. Yes, it makes sense that during this era we are starving even more. However, I immediately removed that last effect by implementing this reform, then that's exactly why I imported so much grain from China. And the effect is gone. And if I wanted to follow the path of traditionalism, I would also choose this option because it weakens the merchants, but I don't want that. Instead, I will soon try to fortify two provinces and prepare for democracy. Another event we have from the start is related to Japan's isolation. My goal will be to end the Sakoku era. Japan really has a lot of these eras at once. If I succeed, I will greatly strengthen the industrialists, the intelligentsia, and the middle class. Otherwise, the peasants and the daimyo will benefit. But that's not all. Japan also has 3 more major events that will appear over time. I'll discuss all of that when it happens. As you can see, from the very beginning, Japan has a lot to do, even though I'll spend the coming years only on this island. So I move on to the budget, and for now, I leave taxes unchanged. I introduce a few consumption taxes and reduce government spending. I'm going to seriously anger the military in the near future, so I'd rather have those extra 2 points of approval. I also don't know what awaits my Japan, so I prefer not to cut the army. And finally, I unpause. Basically, riots start almost immediately, because some merchants are suspected of hoarding food, which drives up prices, and what can I even do here? I guess I'll send negotiators there with strong arguments. Yes, that's definitely the best solution. Fortunately, thanks to my negotiation skills, I very quickly introduce an agrarian reform. But at the same time, I realize I'm an idiot because I forgot about decrees. So in Tohoku, I issue decrees for roads, social mobility, and resource extraction. However, I don't spend all my authority points yet, because I'll still need them to enact laws. The more, the faster. Meanwhile, I built my first tools workshop and my first iron mine. And right away, I ordered the factory to produce better tools, because those will simply be useful for iron extraction. Yes, I finally also allowed the lumberjacks to use normal axes instead of their teeth. Alright, I know they theoretically use some kind of tools, but it always amuses me here when I only now let them use their first proper tools. That's my weird sense of humor. At the same time, a conflict with Russia occurred. Or rather, an incident. Because a Russian merchant tried to enter a port that was not intended for barbarians. I think the Coast Guard did the right thing by firing at that ship. Anyway, I'll also immediately start subsidizing the iron mine and the tool factory. Workers seem to appear faster that way. Literally, they grow before your eyes. And without subsidies, they immediately leave their jobs, even though the factory is profitable. Paradox, what have you done again? In the meantime, while everything was being built, I wanted to move on to further reforms, specifically changing the traditional economic system. And here I made quite a big mistake. In a country like Japan, so backward, it's good to introduce agrarianism at the beginning. And honestly, I was convinced it was unlocked from the start. But no, it requires romanticism. Yes, we all know that working the land is romantic and inspires love. So I had to change my entire research queue. I simply put romanticism at the very beginning. While waiting for romanticism, I carry out a reform of the social system by loosening the Edo system. After all, I need to start doing at least some of the things that lead to reforming Japan, so that later I can open the borders as quickly as possible. Alright, for now I can afford it, so I increase my number of construction sectors and then I move on to a gold mine. It's just pure money and always pays off. Oh, and administration, because the bureaucracy is barely keeping up. And in the gold mine, they somehow want to work even without subsidies. After half a year, I introduced the Edo system reform. Honestly, surprisingly quickly. And best of all, the daimyo aren't angry with me, so I can continue trying to reform the country. Since I've also just researched romanticism, I proceed with agrarian reform. But no one wants to negotiate with me here. So for now, the samurai enter the government because they provide greater support. In 1840, the British arrived at the shores of Japan. And honestly, I'll use the British to catch up militarily, and it only cost me an obligation. Because it will simply increase the spread of technology, not my research, so infantry will always be introduced faster. Well, you see, I let the barbarians in and unfortunately, soon after, a tragedy occurred. The emperor dies. Meanwhile, the shogun's ambitions are growing. Literally, the guy has imperial ambitions. And when I expanded the Tohoku province to the 4th level of urbanization, now I'll focus on a neighboring province where I'll introduce the textile industry. I need to bring 3 provinces to the 3rd level of urbanization. Urbanization simply comes from constructing buildings. I only introduced agrarianism after 4 years. Yes, it took a very long time. But it was probably worth it because it gives me as much as 2.5 million in the investment pool, which I won't use right now, but its time will come. However, because this law took so long to pass, I have no choice. I had to make a very radical move and bring the merchants into the government to carry out a bureaucracy reform. I won't hide it, at first I would prefer to have elected bureaucrats, because that would encourage bureaucrats to align with the merchants. But I don't have time. So I immediately reformed the country toward appointed bureaucrats. Sure, ultimately they are much better for Japan, because they increase tax collection capacity and also boost political strength. The only problem is that bureaucrats are split between the merchants and the Japanese intelligentsia. Surprisingly, when establishing this law, I found support from the samurai. They're basically undermining themselves. I still need to build naval fortification lines along the entire coastline, and after they were completed, I could reclaim from the barbarians the territory that belonged to me, which had a positive effect on tax collection. 11 months ahead of time. Hooray, I managed it, I enact the law, but I'm still only halfway there, because I need to complete 4 general agendas and those reformist ones. But after a moment, the power of the merchants exceeded 10%. And after changing the extraction methods in my mines to the atmospheric engine, GDP also increased. Now I modernized the units and managed to carry out all the necessary reforms, just a few months before the time limit. Yes, it was definitely too close. There will surely be people who will speedrun this, but more importantly, look at the bonuses the merchants receive. Admittedly only for 10 years, but thanks to that, this faction will grow in strength. So now I put the merchants back into the government again, and suddenly their power dropped. Strange. Never mind, I won't worry about it. Now I need to focus on unlocking the country and ending the Sakoku era. From what I can see, attempting to reform the country toward opening up will anger everyone anyway. And it will probably be easiest for me to introduce protectionism, because it is supported by the most social groups. And I'll only anger the samurai and the daimyo. Maybe over time I'll also manage to introduce free trade. Well, that didn't work out. On top of that, I immediately tried to introduce mercantilism, although that might be just as difficult. But I finally invented new tools, steel ones, so I can finally build the foundations of a modern industry, for which nothing is more valuable than coal and iron. And Japan has plenty of both of these resources. Returning to opening the borders. After some time, I managed to convince the daimyo, once they calmed down, not to oppose mercantilism. I guess they got over their anger from the previous law I introduced, because I see they are suddenly happy. In the meantime, I remember that I actually have 2 vassals, and first I simply reduce Ryukyu's autonomy. Soon I will unify Japan. Now it is already my vassal, but I cannot annex it because of isolationism, of course. But it's getting closer. After building the first steel mill, I subsidize this building again, which helps it quickly find workers. And in all my factories producing tools, I switch methods to newer ones. In the meantime, I received bad news that the emperor's son is very sickly, and I must designate a potential successor. And a small trick, I temporarily brought the samurai into the government, because the potential successor may have a modernist trait, which will significantly facilitate Japan's reform. Well, at least in theory it should. And I'll also satisfy the samurai, who are already on the verge of rebellion, and now I bring the burghers back. After the British, the Spanish arrived at the shores of Japan. I will use these foreigners to reform the country socially. Unfortunately, once again it seemed that I wouldn't manage to open Japan to the world. Nevertheless, I succeeded. I introduced mercantilism, and Japan opened up to the world, which will further increase the influence of the burghers and the intelligentsia. And personally, I can finally establish a more stable government, because low legitimacy had been stirring unrest among the Japanese. But more importantly, I can raise taxes. However, opening Japan triggers a series of other crises and events. And I had already seen that light at the end of the tunnel. Ryukyu wants to break away from us and fall under the protectorate of Great Qing. Of course, I won't allow that. It's enough to simply convince Ryukyu to stay by taking these options here, so I immediately conclude a treaty offering 1000 in cash, in exchange for an obligation from Ryukyu that will influence the persuasion process. And surprisingly, it seems I was right about the revere the emperor, expel the barbarians movement. And after opening Japan, it will bring some modernization, but since it happens through a revolution, there wasn't a word about it. Still, it seems to me that nothing has changed here. The movement's leader isn't a modernist either. Never mind, someone in the comments will surely explain what happened here. But since a rebellion is occurring, I'll try to calm the situation and change the conscription law to a modern professional army, which immediately calmed things down. Since I also managed to improve relations with one of the great powers, the process of recognizing Japan as a new power has begun. The Japanese intelligentsia movement is also undergoing reform toward a more standard intelligentsia, but I don't see any changes here. Anyway, let's get back for a moment to building Japan, because I've just developed railways and I'll run a line across the entire country. And that's good, because in some locations I was already starting to lack market access, and unfortunately the frail son of the emperor has died, and the successor is either the shogun or the shogun's son, or even the shogun himself. Fortunately, he will strive to modernize Japan. A year later, an opportunity arises. I can sell opium to the British, and either increase the production of this drug or make the Scots dependent on it. That option seems much better to me. I'll have to sign some supply treaties. I also managed to convince Ryukyu to remain under Japanese patronage. More precisely, Ryukyu will become an integral part of Japan. And the same goes for my second vassal, who unfortunately did not agree to this peacefully. Which was strange, since they don't have any army after all. So they didn't fight for long, and overall this island contains many valuable resources. The only problem is its small population. A solution to this problem comes with an event concerning the 8th Circuit of Japan, which I name the North Sea Circuit, which I hope will encourage the Japanese to migrate there. It also triggered an event that will allow me to develop this region economically. There's quite a lot to do here, but the reward is probably worth the hard work, right? However, the most important reform is still ahead of me, the honorable restoration, in which I will have to reconcile the court and the shogunate, or overthrow the shogunate and restore the court. Because right now, Japan stands at a crossroads. Will it remain faithful to tradition or follow the path of reform? Which I can decide by clicking this. The first option leads to a royal marriage between the emperor and a princess from the shogun's family. This will preserve the status quo and allow the shogunate to survive. The second choice leads to radical reforms. And the first elections in Japan. The shogun himself will step down as the ruler of Japan and instead lead the daimyo faction. And I will choose this path. The shogun must first submit a petition to the emperor and ask about his intentions. If you choose this path, the emperor will decide to return to the throne, which will shake things up in Japan, as it will immediately introduce several laws as well as many new events. We begin by proclaiming another new era. One emperor, one era. This will cause a small part of the aristocracy to become more loyal. But more amusingly, at Tokugawa's urging, we immediately change the electoral system. Only those who own a land can vote. All of this leads to the first elections, though not necessarily free ones. Because as the emperor, you can influence them. After all, your will is the law here. Personally, I do not intend to influence these elections, first among equals. Through confidence and deft maneuver, Tokugawa Yoshinobu has seen through both the restoration of the emperor and the preservation of his clan. And now, as the emperor, I can ensure that the Yoshinobu clan becomes first among equals, as representatives of the new nobility in Japan, or simply one of many servants of the emperor, and I won't hide it, even though that bonus to technology spread is very strong, the emperor is the son of the nation, and his voice matters. Never mind, in both choices I essentially get what is best. The Japanese modernist movement is born, which I immediately decide to support. Oh, a new emperor, who comes from the samurai group. Well, he doesn't have a very modern outlook. These children in Victoria 3 are still terrifying. Seriously, I see a little sociopath here. However, let's be honest, restoring the emperor to power is only the first step in rebuilding Japan. Now I must reform the army, industrialize Japan, and send a research mission to the west. So I really have a lot to do and time is running out. However, I'm starting with tax reform to collect money fairly. What? It's unfair that so little money is flowing into the state budget. Especially since this type of taxation is supported by the entire political class. I wonder if the law will pass on the first try. Well, it didn't succeed on the first attempt. Apparently, 100% support is not enough. Only on the third attempt. Alright, I know perfectly well that it had to pass 3 times to become law, but you've probably already written that in the comments. In the meantime, I'm also trying to figure out how this new interest system works, because I thought I'd be able to declare war on some country right away. But that's not the case. For some reason, it's blocked for me. That's why I started building my interest in the La Plata region, beginning with establishing trade relations with Chile, and the same with Brunei in the Indonesia region. After all, I currently have quite a lot of diplomatic points as Japan. After researching empiricism, I can also switch the traditional Japanese school system to public schools because I have massive support. Which is strange, since I already have an education system in place. And I have to admit, this education system for Japan is incredibly strong, as if I understand it correctly, peasants can have their access to education increased by as much as 45%. And peasants are still the majority of Japanese people. I'll keep this education system for a while longer, but I'll immediately try to introduce a public healthcare system. Going back to the La Plata region, it really seems that you need to reach the second level of presence in a given region to be able to carry out any aggressive actions. However, as you may have noticed, Japan is on an island, so in short, I need a fleet. So I can move on to the new system that was introduced with this DLC. In the military tab, when we go to the navy, we can create a ship template that we want to build. A window like this opens, and okay, it resembles HOI, but it's much simpler, because instead of a billion options, there are somewhat fewer. Plus unique modifications. There are quite a lot of ship types themselves, and it will be possible to have fun with it. I think it will definitely matter in multiplayer. The ships themselves can be modified in terms of armor. The stronger the armor, the higher the cost, of course, but the ship can also take more hits before it sinks. Armament is simply the equivalent of dealing damage. The harder we hit, the faster we sink enemy ships. And I won't hide it, I really like the changes that happen when we modify these ships. The type of propulsion affects the ship's speed, and the whole fleet always moves at the speed of the slowest unit. When it comes to cargo capacities, the larger it is, the more troops we can transport and supply. Supply affects how long the fleet can operate at sea before it has to return to port. Plus, each ship can have special traits. After creating templates, I simply create a fleet to which I can then recruit an admiral. But first, I need ships, so let's build them. and that's very simple to do. Each fleet can consist of these 3 types of ships, and if we already have something prepared, we just queue up the construction. For now, I don't want too large a fleet, because I'm not sure what I can afford, and what composition should actually be used, but now ship production has started. Alright, this fleet would be building if I allocated at least half of my shipyard's production to the military fleet, although from what I can see, I still need to invent troop transports. Now I can send my delegation to the west, which will lead to a series of visits to various countries, and when a few years later the minister finally returned to Japan, I was faced with a choice of which direction to reform the country. For me, industry was the most important, and now I will have a chance to catch up in this field. So now I have to deal with the samurai. The only thing left for me here, really, is to remove them from the government, which will be difficult and painful because they are members of the largest party. Oh yes, this is going to hurt. But now I have all the conditions fulfilled, and an important decision lies ahead of me. Will I keep the samurai as commanders in the officer corps, or has the time of the samurai finally come to an end? Yes, we all know what the answer is. I can already picture that movie in my mind, the same one you're thinking of, dear viewer, but now at least they are patriots. Still, I have to continue working on the industrialization of Japan. It is the longest process. Although many locations have already reached the required level, I have also established very close relations with the British, which led to the signing of the Anglo-Japanese Trade Treaty. And Japan has finally started to be treated as a powerful empire. With the progress in developing my new 8th region, I can decide whether additional types of farms will be created there. To be honest, I have a certain plan here, because I know what I will be selling to the British. Not much at first, but I will be able to expand it. A few years later, the process of Japan's industrialization came to an end, which turned Japan into a modern power, one that is now entering the path of creating an empire, a beautiful red empire. Alright, but that actually changed, because right after that I got uprisings that forced me to change the voting system in the country. And basically I played my Red Japan until the year 1901. I know I skipped some time, and I didn't conquer anything, but that's because once I got into the rhythm of building, as usual in Victoria 3, I lost track of time. Especially since I was still reforming quite a lot of laws. Then I moved on to building the army in a rather standard way, with one exception. That is, I simply have mostly infantry, additionally artillery in very similar numbers, and some cavalry to quickly occupy territory. On the other hand, I have 2 separate armies composed of marines. This is the only formation that does not suffer any penalty for naval landings. Every other type of unit has as much as a 25% penalty. And all these armies have the following mobilization. As for the fleets, I built them essentially like this. Few heavy ships with a bombardment bonus, which are meant to support landings. But I can also mention that the more modern the ship, the more additional options it simply has. Some escort frigates, but I built a lot of transport ships. Unfortunately, I only researched better ships later and didn't have time to modernize the fleet. Even so, it is twice as strong as China's fleet. For these fleets to function at all, you currently need to construct this type of building. It recruits sailors who will be employed in the fleet. In the meantime, I also encountered problems that I don't remember having in my previous Japan campaigns, although the last time I played Japan was probably a year ago. One of my biggest problems is food shortages, although that may not be surprising considering I have a 2% population growth. When it comes to economic power, Japan is number 1. I even surpassed the British Empire, which is strange, but the time has come for Japan's imperial ambitions and the invasion of Korea. Because after all, Japan simply considers these territories to be its own. In this war, I'll try to persuade the Russians to side with me, because that will allow my armies to land in Korea, and it's possible that the entire Chinese army will be drawn earlier to the Russian front. I am curious how naval invasions work now. And it worked. Russia is on my side, and I demand the return of all of Korea. However, the war is a bit bigger than I expected, because Germany has joined it. I myself start with naval invasions using both of my fleets, as well as both of my invasion armies, but only in 2 regions. And in general, naval invasions work better now. Because there is no teleportation of armies, fleets have to transport actual troops from naval bases to the place where the invasion will take place. The landing has begun, Russia is fulfilling its role and drawing large Chinese forces away. But at the same time, not really. The Chinese are still sending armies to these landings, and the game speed has dropped drastically. Maybe it's because this is quite a large-scale war. Fortunately, the naval invasion is progressing, and it looks like I just need to win 4 battles. Well, at least in one place I'm making progress, because the second landing is only distracting the Chinese army. So it's confirmed the old tactic of multiple landings still works. And that's right, after 4-1 battles, I managed to secure a foothold in Korea. I immediately transfer my largest army to the front so it can take position on the line. But note, I need a fleet for that. So the army can move from Japan to Korea, and it seems that if the transport capacity of the fleet and the army are not equal, then the transport is simply very slow. Let the large army advance, while the marines hold defensive positions, and now I've sent my larger fleet to patrol and intercept the Chinese fleet. But I ran into the German one, which is sinking me. And unfortunately, I need reinforcements on the front, because suddenly 300,000 Chinese troops have moved against me. Of course, using the fleet, I transport that army. This move ultimately allowed me to push the Chinese out of Korea, and even later to drive them into the territory of Manchuria. The capital of China is still Beijing, so maybe I'll capture it. Although that might be difficult because Russia has just capitulated. However, it did its job. The territories that are the war goal have been conquered, and all that remains is for me to wait for victory. And that happened less than half a year later. Beautiful Red Korea. Overall, this war went much easier than I expected, and I think my fleet didn't even notice that it was already over. I incorporate the territories of Korea into the empire, and I'm also building administrative buildings here. And still, I have yet to establish Japanese rule in Korea. I've got quite a few requirements to fulfill here. Never mind, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, maybe I'll record more from Japan or another country in Victoria 3. Remember that you can use the link to buy this DLC and support my channel at the same time. And if you're craving more conquest, you can check out how I build an empire from Poland in Europa Universalis 5.